Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is the relentless AI-driven expansion of dynamic pricing, and it's moving across entirely new sectors, far beyond its traditional homes and, airlines and hotels. We're now seeing grocery giants like Walmart and Kroger rolling out electronic shelf labels that allow for these real-time price adjustments. Fast food chains like Wendy's are experimenting with peak time pricing, and even major events like the FIFA 2026 World Cup are implementing some pretty sophisticated variable ticketing models.
And this proliferation is, well, it's certainly understandable from a pure mathematical perspective. Dynamic pricing is rooted in a pretty simple economic truth that a customer's willingness to pay, their WTP, it just varies dramatically across occasions, time, and demographics.
Exactly. It's an optimal tool for managing constrained capacity and fluctuating demand. But this rapid expansion into highly visible, frequently purchased goods, it raises a really critical question for us. Does the demonstrable economic efficiency and the long-term increased resource accessibility offered by dynamic pricing fundamentally outweigh the documented immediate risks of consumer backlash, loss of trust, and what people see as exploitation?
Mm, that is the central tension of the entire movement, right there.
I'm going to argue that economic efficiency and the resulting long-term consumer benefits are, well, they're an inevitable force. They're essential for optimal resource allocation and ultimately beneficial to society, provided firms approach this with competitive rigor.
And I'll be arguing that those non-economic factors, specifically public perception, trust, and consumer alienation, are just so potent and immediate that they often negate any potential efficiency gains. This makes pure dynamic pricing fundamentally unstable unless it's, heavily disguised or implemented only under very specific market conditions.
So my core position, it really rests on this idea that dynamic pricing, DP, is fundamentally a rational engine for optimal resource allocation, and that it ultimately serves the public good by making services more accessible to a wider demographic. We have decades of evidence in the textbook sectors, airlines, and hotels. When capacity is finite and demand fluctuates wildly, DP ensures the resources used efficiently.
While the logic of optimization is clear, I think we have to look past the technical capability and really examine the systemic outcome.
But the systemic outcome is better for the consumer collectively. The system accommodates both the high-margin and the high-volume customer. The leisure traveler, for instance, secures affordable tickets by booking well in advance, effectively filling the base load and, well, perhaps subsidizing the system. Meanwhile, the business traveler can still find last-minute seats, paying a premium for that crucial convenience and availability. Without that pricing flexibility, the average everyday price for everyone would have to be dramatically higher. I mean, just consider the Amtrak line between Philadelphia and New York. Prices can swing from $10 to $200. Without that enormous range, the train line would be far less accessible to students and low WTP travelers because the fixed cost of running the train would necessitate a high floor price for all tickets.
That assumes the gains are perpetually passed down, which is often the great hope of these efficiency arguments.
But they are in competitive markets. Look at the airline industry itself, which pioneered modern DP algorithms. The cumulative net profits for that industry globally since 1978 deregulation are zero, or slightly negative. This is a crucial data point. It means that the fierce competition fostered by DP, the ability of rivals to immediately counter a price hike, results in the gains being passed almost entirely to consumers over the long term. They're not perpetually hoarded by the firms. I call it the Thai boxing model. Competition is constant, it's brutal, and it's aggressive, and prices get pushed down constantly. It benefits the consumer, even if the individual firm occasionally wins a battle.
In high-volume retail sector, I'm talking fast food, groceries, fashion, is going to behave like a deregulated, constrained capacity industry like air travel. I come at it from a different perspective. The real-world implementation risks are just so immediate and so severe that they destabilize the entire model. Consumers instinctively resist dynamic pricing when it smells like opportunism, and that resistance overrides any long-term economic promise.
But that sounds like a failure of communication, not a failure of the economic principle itself.
I think it's a failure of social acceptance. Historically, we saw this with Coca-Cola's 1999 experiment with smart vending machines that raised prices in hot weather. Critics immediately decried it as exploitative opportunism, and the U.S. launch was just shelved. More recently, the Wendy's case is a major cautionary tale. They invested $20 million in these AI-powered digital menu boards, intending to shift demand to off-peak hours. But the public immediately jumped to the conclusion of Uber-type surge pricing for burgers, and it led to a trending #boycott-Wendy's.
Right, but the backlash was based on a misunderstanding of their actual intent, which was to offer discounts during slower periods, not to raise prices during peaks.
That may have been the clarification, but the initial interpretation proves my point. The public is actively hostile to price increases tied to immediate necessity. Critics rightly noted the fundamental difference between Uber's surge pricing and what Wendy's appeared to be doing. Uber's surge pricing is a feedback loop, right? High prices attract more drivers, which expands supply and then brings prices down. But higher fast food prices during the lunch rush, however, they don't magically increase the number of burgers available or reduce the wait time. They simply allow the firm to extract more profit from hungry customers who are already waiting. And that leads directly to the perception that the customer gets the short end of the stick. The third critical condition for successful DOP avoiding customer alienation is frequently not met in these new low-margin sectors, regardless of the technical ability to calculate a perfect price point.
Okay, let's pivot directly into that tension then. The measurable benefits of efficiency versus this more amorphous concept of public value perception. I argue the increased efficiency is tangible and it accrues to the public, especially as DP moves into retail. You mentioned the limitations of supply, but consider where we are seeing AI pricing systems deployed now. Walmart and Kroger's electronic shelf labels. This technology is being used not just for WTP extraction, but crucially for waste reduction and inventory management.
I'm not entirely convinced that the primary driver is waste reduction, though that is a fantastic corporate narrative.
But it's measurable. If a grocer can dynamically discount perishable goods that are approaching their expiration date, they reduce massive amounts of waste and they move inventory quickly. That cost saving doesn't just benefit their bottom line. Less waste, more efficient inventory cycles, and better supply chain management, all of that drives down the overall cost structure of the firm. And when firms compete, like in that Thai boxing analogy, those cost savings are passed on, resulting in lower base prices for the consumer over time. And that far outweighs the frustration of seeing a peak price increase on one specific item.
That is a compelling hypothetical, sure. But the problem is the immediate visceral experience of the customer who's standing right there in the aisle. The perception of opportunism, which was so evident in the Wendy's reaction, shows that the public does not distinguish between D that expands supply and D that merely extracts maximum value during moments of necessity, like needing lunch or needing groceries. The economic model, no matter how efficient on paper, it becomes irrelevant if it lacks perceived fairness. And furthermore, I question whether waste reduction is truly the future. If a firm realizes it can charge $3 more for eggs on Saturday morning versus Tuesday afternoon, the incentive to prioritize waste UTP extraction over operational efficiency becomes extremely high, given the technology.
But that high price is precisely what manages demand and resources. If Wendy's could successfully communicate that the peak time premium was being reinvested immediately into surge staffing, attracting more workers to reduce wait times, would the backlash have been the same? I doubt it. The failure was in linking the price increase to a direct improvement in value delivery. The system itself has the potential to solve capacity issues if the price signal is used correctly.
You are asking consumers to give the company the benefit of the doubt, and the evidence suggests consumers are increasingly unwilling to do that, especially when the transactions are high frequency and low engagement, like buying fast food or a carton of milk.
Okay, well that leads perfectly into our second contention, consumer empowerment and information asymmetry. If transparency is high, doesn't the power shift back to the buyer? I'd argue that dynamic pricing actually empowers the savvy consumer. Knowledge is power. Those who monitor fluctuations and shop vigilantly, the way you might monitor stock prices or hotel rates, can consistently secure lower prices. The transparency inherent in digital price changes, like those electronic shelf labels, it means the information is available to those who seek it out.
That's a romantic view of the consumer, I think. It fundamentally misunderstands human behavior in the context of daily transactions. Even in industries where DP is long established and highly sophisticated, it still fuels chronic perceptions of unfairness. I mean, airlines are the poster child for consumer frustration, despite decades of the industry mastering this complex pricing strategy. Suggesting that the average person needs to become a savvy investor just to buy a carton of eggs, it undermines the essential idea of a simple, trustworthy transaction in daily life.
But the less informed consumer who pays the higher price is typically the high WTP consumer who values convenience and time above all else. They are paying for a premium service, guaranteed last-minute availability, or the ability to grab lunch right now without planning ahead. They're getting value in return, even if they don't explicitly track the price swings.
I see that argument for high-value transactions like business flights, but not for retail. When the price of milk shifts during the day, the high WTP consumer is just paying more for the exact same milk, often because the retailer is trying to leverage a moment of perceived necessity. For the vast majority of consumers, this shifting, opaque pricing leads not to empowerment but to generalized distrust. It forces us to constantly question if we got the best deal, turning a simple chore into an unnecessary portfolio management exercise.
I think you overestimate the widespread nature of this distrust and underestimate the societal benefit of accessibility. If firms couldn't charge high prices to those willing to pay for last-minute capacity, the base price would necessarily have to rise to cover fixed costs, making the resource less available to the low WTP consumer. That is a net social loss, even if a few people feel annoyed by a shifting price. The frustration you cite is noise, I think. It's created by a minority who are simply resistant to technological adaptation in the marketplace.
I would argue that frustration is a fundamental market veto signal. Consumers are not frustrated because they are resistant to technology. They are frustrated because they sense opportunity. The price has to be rooted in a supply and demand logic that benefits the customer not just in the perceived ability to extract maximum profit because a firm can identify a high WDP moment. And this brings us directly to the question of framing.
Framing, as we know, can be everything in behavioral economics. So my third contention is that the necessity and the success of dynamic discounting proves that the core economic mechanism of DP is viable. The issue is merely one of communication and psychological framing. Wendy's was forced to clarify that their intention was to use the digital boards to offer discounts and value offers during slower periods, what we would call dynamic discounting.
I would frame that necessity very differently.
This framing adjustment, starting high and offering variable discounts, is all that is required for success. It achieves the exact same optimal price points and resource allocation that traditional dynamic pricing aims for, but it is psychologically much more palatable. It ensures customers feel served because they are receiving a deal rather than feeling penalized by a hike.
The necessity of pivoting immediately to dynamic discounting is the strongest possible argument against the inherent stability of pure dynamic pricing. If a firm must immediately disguise a potential price hike as discounts during slower periods just to avoid a massive #boycott trend, then the public's resistance to charging more during peak times is a fundamental, non-negotiable veto. Wendy's realized their technical capability was irrelevant if they failed that critical third condition, avoiding alienation. Discounting only works because nearly everyone gets the psychological trophy of having secured a deal, artificially manufacturing a perception of value where opportunism was initially feared.
But if the firm achieves the exact same optimal allocation of resources and long-term competitive health by adopting dynamic discounting, doesn't that show the market accepts the economic mechanism, provided it's communicated transparently and framed around value creation? It is a pragmatic solution to a temporary PR challenge, not a failure of the economic model itself. It demonstrates the flexibility needed for DP to mature across new sectors.
It's a critical admission that the pure economic model of surge pricing for necessity goods is socially unacceptable and inherently unstable. Firms that fail to learn this lesson, that they cannot extract value tied to necessity without severe backlash, will fail. Those who succeed, like the grocers who discount their expiring inventory, are successful because they frame the price shift as solving a shared problem, like waste or inventory, rather than solving their own problem, which is maximizing profit at lunchtime. The risk remains acute, particularly as DP moves into sensitive daily purchases like essential groceries.
So, to summarize my position, dynamic pricing is a competitive necessity and an efficient economic engine that optimizes constrained resources. While firms must prioritize transparent communication and psychological fairness, and yes, utilize tools like dynamic discounting when necessary, the collective, long-term use of DP will ultimately benefit society at large. It does this by increasing accessibility and efficient competition, which is evidenced by the zero-profit collective margin we've observed in the mature airline industry.
And my position is that the failure to secure that critical third condition, avoiding customer alienation, is the greatest, most immediate threat to DP's success and long-term stability in new markets. The material repeatedly shows that pure economic optimization is insufficient. Firms must prioritize making customers feel served, often requiring them to adopt these defensive, psychologically palatable mechanisms like dynamic discounting to prevent the rapid, damaging erosion of trust we saw in the fast food industry. If the public perceives opportunism, the system is rejected. Plain and simple.
I think we agree on the importance of the customer feeling served, but we fundamentally disagree on whether that is an achievable communication goal that will eventually normalize dynamic pricing, or if it is a fundamental constraint on the economic mechanism itself when applied to high-frequency, low-margin goods.
Exactly. The rapid expansion of dynamic pricing into grocery retail and fashion will provide new and highly visible tests of whether sophisticated algorithms or sophisticated customer psychology proves more critical for long-term survival in this rapidly evolving market landscape. There are clearly multiple valid ways to interpret the future trajectory of this pricing strategy.